Okay, and welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the golden age of Dutch painting, the Dutch Baroque. So let's get right into it. So when we talk about this region of the world, we're really talking about this section right here. We commonly call this the Low Countries, but it's actually the Netherlands. Zooming in, you can see the Netherlands is largely defined by a series of massive inlets and bays. The largest up here is the Zuiderzee. And as you might imagine, this means that the Dutch had lots of ships and lots of trading networks. It's kind of what defines them. The Dutch Golden Age is defined by this period when the Dutch break away from Spanish control. Remember, this is a very complicated region. We used to call this area Flanders, the Low Country, but when it forms into the Netherlands is when it breaks away from Spanish control. This is the period of the Protestant-Catholic Wars. Now, in a lot of cases, the big powers, the Holy Roman Empire and Spain, would go in and invade areas and conquer areas under the pretense that they were there to protect Catholics in those territories. So ostensibly it was a religious war, but oftentimes it was just politics and imperialism. But the Dutch had incredible ships, and so they defeated the Spaniards in a massive armada and managed to pull away and create their own unique republic that is predominantly Protestant. Now, there's still Catholics there. It's majority Protestant. It's not exclusively Protestant. Utrecht remains a Catholic stronghold within it. But it becomes a fundamentally different thing. And this changes the nature and the character of the art at the time. So since it's breaking away from these Catholic powers, the Holy Roman Empire, the Spaniards, you can guess that the art is not going to be nearly as Catholic. And the patronage is going to change as well. So in Spain, Holy Roman Empire, you're going to get the king, the aristocracy, the church. They're going to be the major patrons, and they're going to dictate the subject matter. But we have an entirely different thing going on here. Here, we have a major merchant class developing. The merchant class rises on the strength of their shipping networks. Not only did they have more ships than any other European power at the time, their ships were just better, deeper hulled, could go farther. And they used those ships to travel the world, and they developed an incredible trading network. We often talk about Indonesia as formerly as the Dutch East Indies, which got them silk, cotton, fabrics, spices of all kinds, but they also traded to Japan, Africa, West Africa. They were part of the West Atlantic transatlantic slave trade, unfortunately. But we also have Dutch colonies in Latin America, and we also had Dutch colonies in America. New York was once New Amsterdam. Why they changed it, I can't say. People just liked it better that way. Well, actually, the They Might Be Giants song is actually kind of wrong. I don't think they liked it better that way. The truth is, they lost to the English, and the English got to rename it. And I'm sure there were a lot of Dutch people who were very sour about that. So for about 70 to 80 years, it was the great maritime power. And this power was based on mercantilism, large shipping networks. And this elevated the middle class and the merchant class. And it also elevated nationalism and pride. This is a very common scene that you see from the time period. This is the region of the Netherlands, but imagined as this roaring, triumphant lion that you can see here. Here is the Zuiderzee. This is the Inland Sea. This region over here is Holland. People sometimes confuse Holland with the Netherlands. Holland is actually a region of the Netherlands. It's a very important region. It's where most of the principal cities are found, but it's just a region. So this would be like confusing Texas with the United States, which admittedly is something that Texans do all the time. You lived in Texas, I can say that. I lived in Texas, so I can get away with that. So we sometimes confused Holland with the Netherlands, but Holland was just the largest and most important part of the Netherlands. But the Netherlands was this incredibly rich society. And so all of this wealth, all of this pride fundamentally pops up in the art, and it changes the art. For one thing, you're going to see a lot of maps in the backgrounds of these paintings. This very famous Vermeer painting, which probably shows Vermeer in his studio, has on its back wall a painting. And although this painting is turned 90 degrees, this is in fact a map of the Netherlands. You can see There is the Zuiderzee right there. And so again, this is a way of expressing pride. And all of this is expressed in many of the paintings. I love this painting for the same reason. Not only do we get a map on the background, but there's all kinds of details from the objects hanging on the walls to the things on the floor that let you know about how the Dutch feel about this new expanding era of their empire. Well, for one, this is called a merry company, so it's a group of people who are gathered around drinking. Notice how the woman is prominently displayed. Everybody is decked out to the nines in their frilled shirts and everything else. But notice also we have weapons on the floor. We have vessels indicating wine. We also have music. We also have a monkey. The monkey indicates that, yes, they did have trading contacts all the way to tropical areas. So this whole picture, in one way or another, represents the zeitgeist of the era, that you have this rising economic status of the Dutch nation at this time. And they really like to show it off. I also love this because it shows a little bit of the Dutch cheek, and yes, that is a pun, because you'll notice that this character is exposing his backside to us, and that's hardly accidental. He's given it to the audience, saying, "Yay, Dutch." You'll also notice that there's an awful lot of orange in these paintings. Oh my gosh. When you look at these paintings, you'll see orange slathered on everybody. That's because orange was the national flag at the time, and it still remains a national color. Go to any soccer match where the Netherlands is playing in the World Cup, and there's usually just going to be a sea of orange in one section in the stands. So even though the Dutch national flag today is red, white, and blue, the orange still remains as kind of very much this national color. You're also going to see a different character in the kind of paintings depicted. This is a key example. This is Frans Hals and the officers of the St. George Militia Company. This is not a group of nobles or a group of church officials. It's not history painting in the sense that it's a Christian or a historical or classical theme. Instead, it's contemporary people who were contemporary middle-class people of the time. This is a militia. A militia was a private military that was organized to defend the area, and as you can see, they're very proud of their station. They hold their weapons, their pole arms, and they're displayed prominently. You can also see this in paintings like this. This is not the kind of painting that you would have seen in Spain or Italy that was dominated by a king, an aristocracy, and a Catholic church. Instead, here you get the syndics of the Drapers Guild. Drapers were people who sold tapestries, and very prominently, you can see displayed on the table in front of them is an Islamic rug. And so these things were luxury items. They wanted to show their wealth, their cosmopolitan nature, that they had this capacity to trade at distance. But notice also they are very professionally dressed in black. Black becomes the standard for professional dress. It's what you see professionals in the higher middle classes dressing. And they're very much proud of their wealth. So this is a guild. This isn't, a group of saints. It isn't a group of classical heroes. It isn't even a group of nobles or kings or popes or cardinals. It's ordinary middle-class people showing off their wealth and their prestige. So the character of art is going to be different. You have a much different art market going on in the Netherlands. Because you have a rich middle class, art isn't going to be sold on commission. The old system of patronage, where you had to be part of a guild, you had to be an apprentice to a master, you had to get commissions, you got commissions from wealthy patrons, and you were more or less owned by the patrons, was not true in the Dutch Republic. So in the Dutch Republic, you had artists that were more or less selling artwork one painting at a time. There was a kind of art market. Some things were done by commission, and we'll see some of those powerful commissions, but a lot of things were just done, to sell. So you have a much more free market kind of approach. And because the people buying are coming from what we would consider the middle class and not from the church or from people from nobility, it's going to have a much varied interest. And it really shows off the Dutch character. The Dutch can have a real sense of humor. They tend to be very conservative. They're every bit as nice as they are depicted in Spider-Man Far From Home. That's a stereotype that they put up with. They're very, very nice, but they can also be Very cheeky and very fun, very tongue-in-cheek, and we'll see that in the artwork. So right off the bat, we do have the importation of a lot of ideas coming from the Italian Baroque. And so we have Caravaggio. One of the earliest Caravaggio is Honthorst. Honthorst is working in the area of Utrecht. Utrecht remains a Catholic center in a largely Protestant country. And so you see the importation of the ideas of Caravaggio. Now, I want to point out, Caravaggio's dead 1610. So already here, just not even a decade later, we are seeing artists experiment with Caravaggio's style. So we have these single light sources, this deep tenebrism, these figures back into shadow. We're seeing characters in elaborate kind of theatrical costumes. And so there's a lot here that is pulled from Caravaggio. But there's also some things that are going to be different. And again, they have to do with the Dutch character. This scene isn't going to take a bunch of people and recast them into a classical mythology or a Christian mythology. It instead is going to show genre. And genre is scenes of everyday life. And here we have people eating at a table, enjoying food, celebrating, drinking wine, playing music. As I've often said, I don't support sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I'm very traditional. I much prefer wine, women, and song. So those things are eternal. And so you're going to see a lot more women in the art, and you're going to see a lot more ordinary people in the art and scenes of everyday life. It's not all just going to be Catholic saints or classical mythology. And so with this style being imported into the Netherlands, we're very much going to see a rapid growth of Caravaggio of people who are following it. Now let's get to, by far the most famous out of all of them, Rembrandt. So Rembrandt is active in Leiden and Amsterdam, and he's by far the most versatile and influential of the Dutch portraitists and masters. He starts out painting, and he paints portraits. But again, one of the things that's really curious about Rembrandt is we have a lot of self-portraits. Remember, he doesn't have a lot of patrons. He doesn't have that kind of established patron relationship that you might see in other countries. So he's going to be painting for himself. Well, if you're painting for yourself and you run out of models, the great thing about being an artist is you always have yourself. So he used his self-portraits as a way to kind of self-market. He would put out those portraits. What's interesting is the self-portraits actually show his development, not just in age, but also as an artist. So here you can see a portrait that he painted when he was very young, when he was just becoming an established artist. And you can see that it's very much inspired by Caravaggio. We have this tenebrism, this darkness. Notice that the face is very tight. He isn't using a lot of loose brushwork. But by the time you get to the end of his life, he has aged in more ways than one. He actually had a very tough life. I think he lost 3 children. They died early, and his career actually went downhill towards the end of his life. So he had a very, very tumultuous life. And so these paintings not only show how he's aged as a person, they also show how he's aged as an artist. Believe me, I get this. I love the paintings of his self-portraits because I look in the mirror every day and it's like looking into the portrait of Dorian Gray. I see myself decaying, and I'm confronted with my own mortality. If only I could do it as gracefully as Rembrandt. But you could see in these paintings that from the beginning he starts off in a much tighter style and he starts getting more experimental. Notice how thick and heavy the paint gets on the hands and on the extremities, how loose the brushwork is appearing. You can see that in one of his last self-portraits, this one from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Look at how soft the light is. So the one thing that Rembrandt adds to the Caravaggio style is that by the time he gets older, he is putting down paint in thicker patches of color. He gets a softness, an appreciation for light that not even Caravaggio had. Caravaggio was something of a realist, but he starts using the paint impressionistically so that we get these soft blended edges. We get this detail on the face. And I love you seeing the brushwork over here almost as like underpainting. It's not even finished. And you get these wonderfully complex surfaces. And we see that he's making that same evolution that, say, Velázquez was making. Velázquez started in his life painting pretty tight, in the Caravaggio style, using lots of thin glazes and lots of tonalities, but by the end, he was just slapping that paint on, and it was only one layer thick. And he was using a lot more of the surface to gain a lot more expression. And so Rembrandt went through that same evolution in his own life, moving the paint from these long, deep tonalities with lots of built-up glazes to more surface detail, to more impasto, to a rich textual, a rich textile-like surface, tactile surface. So let's look at some of his early works, and we see right from his early works this power that he brings to it. Again, this was done earlier in his life, and so you can see of this deep tenebrism. We have people dressed professionally in black. You can see they have their wonderful ruff collars. When are ruff collars ever going to make a comeback? Huh? But, I've lived long enough to see bell-bottoms come back 3 times. And we're not going to get ruff collars? I swear. But these men, by their dress, are obviously professionals, dressed in black. And what we're seeing here is a group portrait. Now, when you think of group portraits, again, the whole idea of a group portrait is very Dutch, because you want to show a kind of equality amongst all of these figures. Usually, in the other worlds, in the Catholic worlds, it's going to be a saint, a figure. You're not going to have a lot of group portraits. And he probably had each of these individuals sit independently, but he's masterfully woven them together into a single scene. Except for this guy. This guy always looks like he's just walked in and he's photobombing it. But everybody else, they aren't just sitting there. They aren't just a bunch of floating heads. Like a typical classroom portrait where you're all like, yeah, stare at the camera and smile. They're all actively engaged with the subject matter. And so what is that subject matter? The subject matter is the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp. So Dr. Tulp was a famed anatomist of the region, a very successful doctor, and one of the earlier champions of actually learning from dissection and from anatomy. And he is here displaying for them the anatomy of the hand. Now, the anatomy of the hand is often one of the most difficult to get, and it has so many tendons, so many nerves and blood vessels, that this was the most difficult part of anatomy. And so that's a way of highlighting his achievement by here showing off the hardest part of anatomy. But I love how the light is used. If you think back to Caravaggio, remember how he used light as a kind of emblem of spirituality. That the light came from the spiritual figures and landed on the spiritual figures and then emanated outwards to the people who were more worldly or spiritual. Here, light is done the same way. It's amazing that the most brightly lit section is the body itself. You notice the face is kind of half in shadow, but the body itself is illuminated, giving all of this emphasis on the anatomy. So here, light serves a similar purpose. It draws our attention to the body, but it also highlights it. Here, the light is not the light of the spirit, it is the light of knowledge, of scientific reason and understanding. The 17th century is often the period known as the Scientific Revolution. It is where we finally started to develop the scientific method in the West. It had existed before centuries earlier in Islam, but that's another story. It's where we started to develop the scientific method in the West. It's where we started to advance based on knowledge. And here he is this prominent figure, and all of his various students are gathered around him. Now, while this is probably staged, what we would call photoshopped, he probably painted them all individually, did studies of them individually, and combined it together. These kind of displays were one of the things that made Dr. Tulp famous. He would actually give public anatomy lessons. He would actually do surgeries in public. Remember, there's no YouTube, there's no textbooks or anything like that. So if you're going to learn these things, you have to learn these things firsthand. And so there's a chance that Rembrandt actually saw one of these surgical demonstrations, and this influenced him. And so these were kind of spectacular events, but again, events of learning. You'll notice that books are included to make that case. So it's a very, very powerful group portrait that tells a very strong message. It doesn't just say, hey, here are all these students of Dr. Tulp. It doesn't just line them up like in mugshots. It tells a story. And this elevates his status. This is probably what gets him his most famous commission, which is the shooting company of Frans Hals, which is more commonly called the Night Watch. Now, the night watch is misunderstood. Everybody thinks that, oh, that this is a night scene. It's actually not a night scene. Night watch doesn't refer to the scene. The night watch refers to their function. Okay? So I mentioned before that there are no municipal police forces in the 17th century. In fact, there wouldn't be municipal police forces until the 19th century. If you were wandering a city prior to that, you were pretty much on your own. And so private groups would organize into private militaries, militias. And these militias would serve two purposes. One, they could organize quickly to defend the city against invaders, but they would also do a lot of law and order stuff. They would walk the beat and protect the city. And of course, crime goes up at night because darkness covers a multitude of sins. And so therefore, that's why we refer to this as the night watch, because they would go out and watch, things at night. And so right in the center, we have Koch himself. He is there, again, swathed in beautiful orange. His lieutenant is right next to him. And they are dressed in different colors again, and it's widely believed that his lieutenant was, in fact, Catholic, so this was a mixed company. And you have a whole variety of dynamic figures here. We have people who are in various stages of musket drills, loading, blowing out the residue. You have people taking down the arms from the sides. It's a very, very different painting than the kind of painting we had been used to seeing before. And just to go this, I'll show you what these paintings used to look like. So this is known as a Schutterstück. A Schutterstück is a painting of some of these, kind of private militias. And this was one of the first that was ever painted. This is the Claviniers Civic Guard of Amsterdam. But notice again, they're just a row of heads. They're just kind of standing there in their armor. They're bored. They're waiting for this thing to be over. Even when we get to a little bit later in the 17th century, they're oftentimes just arranged as a bunch of heads. Here you can see the heads almost feel like they've been photoshopped on. The bodies are a little too small. Even when we get to this fabulous one by Frans Hals, they're not doing much except kind of standing around. But when we get to the Night Watch, he, instead of having them standing around, just kind of taking up space, he has them actively engaged in the kind of drills and things that they were doing. He even includes the people who are playing music to accompany them in their drills and their activity. And he marshals the light in such a way so that some are in the background, some are in the foreground. The most important figures, of course, they're paying the bills for this thing. They get more prominent treatment, but it becomes a wonderful composition. He has all this action brought to it. He conceives of this not as a group portrait, but as a scene, a dynamic scene in its own right. One of the things that's perhaps the most puzzling is this figure here, which has been debated endlessly. We don't really get a sense of her until you get really close. The light falls on her. She's glowing yellow, and she has a chicken, a rooster, tied under her belt. Well, this is probably an allegorical figure. She probably represents the glory and the personification of the company itself. The Claviniers, one of their symbols was chicken claws against a blue background, and so that is probably a reference to that. So she represents this, and many people wonder if the face isn't taken from Rembrandt's daughter. So this becomes a kind of personification. So we still have this iconography, and you can see the sense of this thing. One of the things that makes it so powerful is the scale of it. You really can't appreciate it unless you see it in the gallery. Now, originally it hung up in the militia's hall, but it was later moved, and when it was moved, people did not have the sense of preservation that they do today. They cut 2 feet off of it from either end. And so we're actually missing big chunks of it. So it would have been even larger. It was cropped down to fit the space. Oh, ouch! You can't even imagine people doing that today. But they were a lot more practical back then. But it really gives you a sense of the scale of it, the magnificence of it. Now, while that's probably the most famous painting Rembrandt ever painted, I'm actually a much bigger fan of his smaller paintings. Even small, some of these are quite large, 5 to 8 feet. And what really captures you is his mastery of light. He picks up on all these features of light that were used by Caravaggio, but then continues to expand on them. A couple of my favorites as an example. This is the blinding of Samson. Long story short, Samson is from the book of Judges in the Bible. Samson is called to protect the Israelites from the Philistines, and so he does. He's kind of an egomaniacal jerk. He's not really a great guy, but God picks all kinds of strange vessels to be his champion, and his power comes from his long hair. Well, he falls in love with Delilah, and Delilah tries to trick him to tell him the secret of his strength, and he tells her all kinds of nonsense, like weave my hair into a loom, or all these other things, and none of it works. And so finally, she says, well, how can you ever trust me? And he's like, okay, fine, it's my hair. If you cut my hair off, I'm powerless. And the dumb idiot does it. So you see Delilah here, and Delilah here has the features that this is probably Saskia, his wife. Which is really interesting, to paint your wife as Delilah. But again, if you're an artist, you got to deal with the models you've got. And she is running away with the scissors and the hair. And this, of course, renders Samson powerless. His great, phenomenal strength is gone. And you see him being blinded. This is just incredibly gory. You have these figures here. This one reaches around with a knife to stab it into his eyes, while the others hold him back. This one holds him at spear point. And the light comes in to illuminate his face, but of course that's the great irony of the scene. He can't see it because he has now been blind. He's blind because he trusted the wrong woman. There's also other wonderful details in here. The armor here and the dress, the turbans, is a little bit exotic, but it's clearly a reference to Near Eastern cultures. Part of that is that, of course, this is from the Bible, and the Bible happened in the ancient Near East, in the Eastern Mediterranean, so a lot of this might just be simple exoticism and Orientalism. When we say Orientalism, we just mean the East, and for the West, the East starts in, like, the Eastern Mediterranean, and so he's just trying to liven it up. But there's also kind of a political message here, because we're still in the 17th century, and the Ottoman Empire is still a major power in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so he has recast the Philistines. I mean, you just say the word Philistine. Philistine represents, somebody who is uncultured. He has recast the Philistines as Turks, which would have been the oppressors of Christianity in his day. So there's a little bit of, racism and, anti-Muslim spirit to this. But still, the power, the use of the light is just really incredible. You remember the story of the Supper of Emmaus, the two disciples who didn't believe that the resurrection was happening, and they met a stranger on the road to Emmaus, and then the stranger later revealed himself as Christ. We saw that in the works of Caravaggio. So he's clearly looking at the works of Caravaggio in this early example. But I love this one because in this case, you see only the barest of silhouette of Christ, and the light is illuminating it. Where is this light coming from? It's almost magically emanating from him, and you see the disciple just kind of aghast. You can hardly see the other disciple, but he's here. There he is. You can see him bending down. His chair has been thrown back because he's in shock, and he's just fallen to his knees because he's realized that he is in the presence of the resurrected Christ. Such dramatic lighting, but notice that his lighting is a softer touch than you would see with Caravaggio. In a way, Rembrandt's touch and treatment of his figures is more sensitive, it's more humanistic. He seems to have a genuine concern for his figures. He's not just trying to get the realism of it, he's trying to eliminate the spirituality of it. The other thing that's really important is that he was a printer, and so we have lots of prints. You can see the same quality of sensitivity of light, and this kind of sense of understanding sin in this print, one of his more famous prints. So this is Christ crucified between the two thieves. Now the story really briefly is Christ is crucified between two thieves, and while he's crucified, he's being mocked. He's being mocked by the Roman soldiers and everyone else around him, saying that, if you be the Son of God, come down off the cross. And one of the thieves says to him, if you're truly the Son of God, save yourself and save us too. And he's saying, save yourself. But the other thief on this side says, shut up to the first thief. He tells the first thief to stop asking Jesus to save him. He says, we deserve our fate. And then he says to Jesus, he says, I only ask that you remember me when you come into your kingdom. And that's where Jesus says, this day you shall be with me in paradise. Now, it's commonly used in Christian dogma as a way of saying, even if you are at the moment of death, even if you are a very sinful person, you still have access to the grace of Christ. And this would have been a very powerful idea to Protestants. Protestants and the Protestant era and all this thinking really do emphasize personal grace, that even at the moment of your death, you can receive the full grace of Christ and be saved. And this is used as a New Testament evidence of that. So that's probably what's being depicted here. And notice how it's depicted. The one thief, the bad thief, who is reviling against Christ and saying, hey, save us, is in literal darkness. And the people reviling Christ over here are shrouded in darkness. But notice that Christ in the center is in light, and the thief over here on his right side, the blessed side, is also in light. So this mastery of light, this mastery of the use of light, is a really, really powerful thing in the works of Rembrandt. And I don't think anybody does it better. Even Caravaggio, I think even Rembrandt does it better than Caravaggio. Our next major painter we're going to talk about is Frans Hals. Frans Hals is active in Haarlem, and he's principally a portraitist. He does group portraits, but you've seen a couple of his beautiful group portraits. But he's also most noted for his painterly method. We see his work in official portraits such as this one. This one, again, wonderful, masterful piece. When we look at the figure here, we can see all this wonderful detail. It's very, very tight, beautiful. Again, rough, professional black. Love the highlights on the sleeve. Notice how painterly he is on the sleeve. This is very much like the works of Velasquez or Titian, where the face is usually painted very tight, but you get away from the face. You're free to be more expressive with the brushwork. Look how loose and open the brushwork here is on the lower body. And just like Velasquez, sometimes his most interesting pieces are not the pieces he paints for official, high-paying clients. It's the stuff he paints on his own time. Remember, Velasquez, when he was painting the various jesters and other courtiers, was free to be looser. In some way, those paintings are a lot fresher because of that technique. They were probably considered studies by Velasquez. So in the same way, when he's not painting formal portraits like this, he's painting portraits like this, and he gets a lot more expressive. This is his famous laughing cavalier, although he's laughing mostly with his eyes. And I know it sounds crazy, but my favorite thing about this is this hat. This hat is just an amorphous blob, and it's almost pure black. There's almost no detail in it. If you get close to this and actually see this thing in person, there's almost nothing in this hat. There's just a subtle highlight here, a wisp of a highlight along the edge that give you the sense of this hat's form, but that's it. It's so masterful. The idea that you can communicate such depth of form with such little brushwork. And then when we get into the lace and the details, especially the lace on the collar, you can see how loose the brushwork is. He really begins to experiment. This one is another one, the Mary Topper, and in this case, the brushwork is very evident. Look at this glass. He hands a glass to you, like a glass of wine. And look, you can literally count the brushstrokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those highlights are so quickly done in. Look at how he's really quickly brushed in the details of the folds in the sleeve. Doesn't care. He's just going at it just really quickly. Again, the hat is this amorphous blob with very few highlights, and yet it's enough. He's painted just enough to make it sing. And so we're seeing a shift in the painting style, away from the glazes of the early 17th century towards a direction of a more painterly style that's more surface. It's more alla prima. Alla prima means all at once. It means there isn't layer after layer of paint. There's just a little bit of paint on the surface, and you can actually count the brushstrokes. And then we get this wonderful one, which really looks like inspiration for some character out of the Leaky Cauldron. She's actually Malbaba. Her name there means this crazy lady. She's this kind of crazy barfly that he probably knew and has this kind of reputation. But look at how quick the brushwork is. Look at how fast it is. You can actually literally count the brushstrokes and the highlights. And he does more with less. Look at this tankard. By the way, in the Netherlands, this is called a sample size tankard. So for all of those who are proud of your drinking ability, go to the Netherlands. They'll drink you under the table. I don't drink, but I have friends that do, and oh boy. And I love this tankard because he captures the full quality of the metal. And there's maybe 3 colors. There's a white highlight, a mid-tone gray, a darker tone gray, and then there's the underpainting that comes through. And with just a few sketchy lines, he gives you the full sense of form of that thing. And so this is why Frans Hals emerges as one of the most influential painters, probably more influential than Rembrandt, because you can actually deconstruct his paintings. Remember how I said that the way you learn in the 19th century to be a painter is you go into the museums, you set up your easels, and you paint studies of the masters. Well, if you're painting studies of the masters, you're not going to paint some master who's painting in thin glazes that you can't even see the brushstrokes. You're going to pick somebody that you can deconstruct by seeing the brushstrokes. And so many painters, Carolus Duran, Edward Manet, John Singer Sargent, went into these museums, and we know that they all had a preference for 2 painters, Velasquez and Frans Hals. That they said these were the grounding of what fresh paint should look like, what a painting should actually be. And so when you get into the 19th century and the Impressionist period, that's where you're going to see it. So let's talk about Dutch genre painting. This is such an important topic, it really should be considered in a separate category. One of the things that really sets Dutch painting away is genre painting. What is genre painting? Genre painting is scenes of everyday life. Remember, we have a burgeoning middle class, but Dutch interiors tended to be small. They tended to be row homes. If you know what a row home is, it has a front and a back, but the wall's attached to the next home over, so it's not like you can have a window. So there's not a lot of lit space. There's a kind of reserved wall space. And so the paintings are going to be smaller, and they're going to be intimate, and they're going to reflect the kinds of things that people are interested in. They're going to be interior scenes, scenes of everyday life, scenes of landscapes and cityscapes. They're kind of decorative, beautiful paintings. You can actually see them hanging on the walls. It's kind of amazing what a commentary this is, that we often see these interior scenes with these paintings. And these paintings would have been sold in open art markets, not as major commissions to major patrons. That fundamentally changes the nature of painting. And they tend to express very much a Dutch Protestant sensibility. They tend to be morality plays or social satire at times. They don't tend to be great classical epic stories of heroes or gods or of Christian theology. They tend to be morality plays, and they very prominently feature women and make lots of commentary on virtue and marriage. Here you can see a woman playing her music, and she is receiving a love letter from the maid. So there are these quiet things, and I love how this is framed in the door, so we could kind of get this inward glance. It's a kind of voyeuristic aspect to a lot of these paintings. Now, this was absolutely baffling to Spaniards and Italians. Spaniards and Italians saw Dutch art in the same way that the Dutch saw Spanish and Italian art, and the Italians were just mystified. There's this wonderful quote, I can't remember who it is by now, and I'll just paraphrase it for you, by an Italian painter who says, "Have you no gods? Have you no heroes? Why are you painting these interior scenes?" And again, it has to do with the Dutch character. If you are American, oh gosh, all you know about the Dutch is, tulips and wooden shoes, or maybe, the fact that you can go to Amsterdam and get marijuana really cheap. But all of that is really kind of a stereotype. The Dutch are, interestingly, because they are both very conservative and kind of liberal and kind of cheeky in their own way, and that character comes out. in their artwork. And this didn't suit the sensibilities of Italians or Spaniards, who kind of downplayed it, but it did suit the sensibilities of the Dutch, who centered their life around the interior home, and were looking for works of art to fill that home. Again, you have to look at this in context of the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation put a lot more emphasis on individual families finding their way to God, and of individual morality, and of course individual work ethic as well. This was part of the kind of Calvinist worldview. The Calvinist worldview is that, how do you know that you're saved? Well, you behave like a person that's saved. They had this view of predestination. So you lived an industrious life, and you worked hard at it because that was the evidence that you were already predestined to be saved. I know this is kind of a little bit of a strange thinking. And so you'll see interior scenes that show domestic tranquility or domestic order, or sometimes the opposite, disorder. You can emphasize the reality of something by emphasizing its positive form or its negative form, and we'll see that. There was also a great interest in emblems and iconography. Jacob Katz was an emblemologist. He was a guy who printed a bunch of books that gave people emblems of how to represent things iconographically. And these were very, very popular. But he also wrote books on public virtue. And he wrote this, the Hullewick. And the Hullewick is a manual for women on marriage. And it dictates, it's really quite frank in places. It talks about sex, it talks about children, but it also talks about how to manage the household. It was one of the first ever kind of self-help books. And again, it was very much considered about this life of propriety. And so a lot of the scenes are going to deal with women. They're going to deal with private morality, but also public propriety. Proprietary is something else, sorry. Propriety, and how you lived a just and a virtuous life. And what's amazing is that for a couple hundred years, we totally misinterpreted these works of art. These works were often just seen as, dainty little cute courtly scenes, and we didn't see that they were really an awful lot about things like sex, infidelity, all kinds of things going on. So if you're really interested in this, I can recommend a few books. First of all, for the general era, you can't beat Simon Schama's Embarrassment of Riches. It's a fabulous book that talks about the era and how this newfound wealth that they found in their society often conflicted with this Calvinist Protestant morality and privacy that a lot of Dutch families had. Another one is Wayne Franet's Paragons of Virtue, where he talks about how women are depicted in Dutch genre art. And you absolutely must read the works of Cynthia Lawrence and Martha Peacock. Martha Peacock was one of my professors at BYU, and they were some of the first to actually dig into these emblem books. It's amazing that people were looking at Dutch art, and for the longest time they were saying, what a genteel courtly scene of a Dutch interior. And because they didn't know these emblem books or these marriage manuals existed, they didn't realize a lot of the ribald and quite frankly sexual innuendo and humor going on in these things. So I've promised sex. Let's get to sex. Let's do it. Let's get to Gerard de Borck. So Gerard de Borck was one of these painters, and he was really known for these beautiful, intimate interior scenes. And he was from a family of painters from Zwolle, and what's interesting is that this region was known for its textiles. So you can look at a Ter Borch and you instantly can get a Ter Borch because he has the most beautiful satin dresses. Take a look at this scene. So this scene is known as the Suitor's Visit, and right away we have very strongly emphasized on the textiles. So because he had access to this beautiful dress, all the beautiful shimmering surfaces off of it. Now, on one side, right off the bat, when we look at this, it just seems to be a kind of intimate, courtly scene, a beautiful interior. It was the kind of thing that people in the 18th and 19th century really didn't understand, and so they just saw it as a kind of genteel scene. Now remember, most of the titles of works of art were not made by the artist. They were added by art historians after the fact, at least up until the 19th century. So this title, as well as some other titles, are absolute pure BS. They are added. So this is the suitor's visit. But we have no idea what Ter Borch actually would have titled it. That's not a bad title, but automatically we don't want to prejudge ourselves based on that title. Okay, so right off the bat, it just looks like there's something going on. It's a very courtly scene. We have a suitor. Notice that he's wearing black and he has beautiful frills, which indicates he's successful, he's rich, and he's of the professional class, and he is meeting this wonderful lady here. And we can see that she's fabulously decked out. So on one level, it just seems to be a courtly scene. Someone engaged in courtship of a, respectable lady. But there are clues here that not all is what it appears. And the first clue is the dog. The dog, remember, there's no photobombing in a painting. If something shows up in the painting, it's because the painter wanted it there. And also remember, if you think back to the paintings of Bruegel, you can think that there's a lot of these fun little iconographic details. There's these emblematic details that are inserted into paintings. So we know that this dog is not just there because he happened to be there. We know that he's there because the artist has inserted him for a very important reason. So what's going on? Well, what matters here, now you may have remembered in the wedding portrait of Arnold Feeney, that there was a dog, and that dog represented loyalty, and that meant sexual fidelity between two figures. So you might guess correctly that this is an emblem of sexual fidelity, but you would guess wrong, because the type of dog matters. And this dog isn't a lap dog. It's a different kind of dog. Now, I love teaching this in class because I always turn this over to the students and I say, what kind of dog is it? And I've taught in Texas and I've taught in Utah. And in Utah, the majority religion is hunting. I think the second largest religion is scrapbooking, and then third after that might be some other religion. But by far the biggest and most religious, activity is hunting. And so I always have a hunter or two that know exactly what kind of dog this is. And they know that it's a pointer. It's a spaniel, and that kind of dog is a pointer. This is a birding dog. This is a dog you use when hunting birds. And, some birding dogs are the kind of that after you shoot the bird, the dog goes and retrieves the bird, like a retriever. Or some are pointers that point out where the animal is in the bush so that you can shoot it. And this is a pointer. So this dog is a birding dog, and it is scaring up a bird, and the bird in this case is this woman. And here's where we get on what was a commonly used expression in the Dutch. To bird, a bird is vogel, and to bird, vogelen, is literally to go scouting up, women. And that it was used that way. And it's actually, be careful if you ever use this, because it does have a vulgar connotation. I'm sure you've all heard of the New York salute, the middle finger, also commonly known as the bird, and it has this very strong sexual connotation. So this has those very same sexual connotations. So right off the bat, we know that not everything is up and up, that there is a very strong sexual connotation here. But who is doing what? So the dog is letting us know that not everything is on the up and up. But there's other things that are going on as well. Notice that the woman is holding a lute, and she's holding a lute here. Now again, as I make this joke all the time, there's nothing new in the world. There are more subtle times, but there are never more innocent times. In the past, it wasn't sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was wine, women, and song. So whenever you have a lute, there's almost always some kind of connotation associating with sex. We associate music with sex, and so something is going on. This also has to do with the fact that the lute has a particular shape. And if you can see me, this is where I turn a bright shade of red, because now I have to get into talking about male and female anatomy. I'll just draw it for you. The lute has a hole, but it also has a long neck. Do I really have to spell this out for you? So this is kind of seen as the consummation of sexual organs here. You have the male sexual organ and the female sexual organ coming together in the shape of the lute. And I know what you're all thinking. You're all thinking, oh, come on. That can't possibly be true. Yes, it's true. Now, when I heard this, I didn't believe it either. But when you get into the emblem books, when you get into some of the discussion of common symbols at the time, yes, the lute does have this kind of association with sexual union. And if you don't believe me, well, check out the neck of the lute, check out the angle, and then notice the angle of the gentleman here, and where the neck of the lute would intersect with his anatomy if it was available, and that's something you'll never be able to unsee ever again. I think I just got this video demonetized forever and always. Yes, it's definitely there. And so these sexual allusions are built right in. And so suddenly you're like, okay, no, wait a minute. So what is going on in this scene? There's another clue of what's going on here. And it's this character in the background. And you can't quite tell, but notice that he's wearing chainmail. Well, what kind of character wears chainmail? This would be a soldier. Now, here's where I offend all the soldiers in the audience. I don't wish to offend vets, but most vets can agree. Soldiers have had a certain reputation in times past. I don't think that's egregious to say. It's just true. It's not my personal judgment. And so we get the sense of what is a soldier doing there and what kind of women does a soldier hang out with. So this takes on an entirely different meaning of what the original intent was. If we look at this, it just seems like, oh, it's a cute little courtly scene. It's something you could give your grandmother, and she'd say, oh, that's nice, and she'd hang it on a wall. And you wouldn't have to mention all the sex and sexual references and anatomical references going on. Please don't. But they're definitely there. So what seems to be happening here is, you could read this a couple of different ways. Either the gentleman is coming and he knows what he's getting into. He knows that he's there for a quickie. This isn't somebody looking for long-term commitment, shall we say, but just a quick roll on the hay. And he knows what he's getting into and knows the kind of women that he's approaching, in which case these are not, not marriageable prospects, but ladies of the evening. If I can throw another euphemism into this. The other possibility is maybe he doesn't. Maybe he is actually serious in his intent and he is a suitor, and the dog and all the other references are saying, probably not worth your time. Probably not worth your time. She is not of marriageable prospect. Now, people always ask me, good gravy, why would you put this on your wall? Why would you put something that had such incredible sexual innuendo up on your wall? Well, I hope you realize that the Dutch are not all pervs, and that's not the intent here. No, this is a morality play, and so you would put this on your wall. For one, it's a beautiful thing to look at, but it's also a morality play for young men and young women alike. It's saying, if you are a young man, know what kind of women you are associating with, and if you are a young woman, don't be these kind of women. It's actually kind of damning to these women in a way. And you can see a lot of this in the works of Ter Borch. This is another one. This has been often one of the most, misunderstood works of art. Again, you can always tell Ter Borch because these fabulous gowns. Oh my gosh, he just paints silk and satin like nobody else. And here you have another guy who, here you can see the chainmail a little better. You can see the sword. You clearly understand that he's a soldier. And for the longest time, this thing had the title of the paternal admonition. The idea being was this was the dad and he was talking to the daughter and giving her advice. And of course, that's not what's going on here at all. That was a kind of boulderized, euphemistic title, to say the least. He's actually holding up a coin. And so we have a soldier here holding up a coin, having a conversation with a woman. What is the conversation about that involves money? I wonder. And if you're very, very curious, you don't have to wonder much, because she's completely framed here in the bed. The bed isolates her off, this four-poster bed. We know what's going down. We know what is being negotiated. So rather than this being a courtly prim interior scene. This is a scene, of course, that is, again, fundamentally about sex. So, again, this is a morality play. This is, don't be these kind of guys. Do not be these kind of women. If you go out into the world, recognize these are the risks of being part of the world. Ter stuff, you can understand how people misread it for a couple of centuries because it's pretty subtle. You have to look very closely at the details, and you have to know these emblems. One of my all-time favorite Dutch painters, Jan Steen, is not that subtle. He specializes in these farces or moralizing scenes. He was, active in Leiden and really focuses on these interiors, but his interiors are just so much more crazy and fun. Let me give you an example. This is one of my all-time favorite paintings. This is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I've seen this one in person, and it's a teeny little painting. You could just take it off the wall, put it inside your sack, and run like heck, and you might actually get away with it. So if you ever become a famous, cat burglar and wish to repay me for these lectures, this is the one I want. I said nothing. I know nothing. Anyhow, I'm going to get a phone call from the Philadelphia Museum of Art if this everything ever goes missing. Oh, gosh. No, but seriously, it shows how it's a small painting. It's a teeny little thing. And yet there's so much crammed back into this. So it's called The Doctor's Visit. And here you have the doctor. Doctor is wearing black, the professional color. He's taking the pulse of this young lady here who is not feeling well. Meanwhile, the mother plays at a virginal. A virginal is a precursor to like the harpsichord and the pianoforte. And she is there playing music. Again, remember, music means sex. And then we have a maid, and the maid is ushering in a young man, and the young man wears scarlet. Now, in this case, the scarlet is probably a reference to sex. Notice that in the painting of Ter Borch, scarlet is always used to kind of highlight, implications of sex. This woman is surrounded by a scarlet bed. This woman has a scarlet bodice, so you get a sense of it. So scarlet here probably means something is going on. But the thing that absolutely throws people off is this character in the background, who just seems like some crazy uncle that wandered into this scene. And notice he's holding a fish, and the fish is directly over the head of our young lady who is just not feeling well. Now, what do fish do? They stink. So the fish is a clear emblem that something here stinks. Something is fishy. And it's not an accident that the face here looks like a self-portrait of Jan Steen himself. So Jan Steen is breaking the fourth wall by holding a fish over this woman, this young lady, and saying, yeah, something is up. Now, it's at this point that if I teach this in class, almost instantaneously, one of the more perceptive members of the audience, usually a woman, usually a female student, will guess what's going on. And of course, what's wrong with this girl? Why is she not feeling well? She's pregnant. She is, in fact, pregnant. But she is lying to her mother. There's a lot of other clues that give to reinforce this. Notice that she has a foot warmer. You would put a clay pot, a brazier full of coals, and set your feet on that. Feet fetish have been a thing for centuries. So warm feet indicates that you are hot to trot, so to speak. But here is the actual brazier itself. And notice that it has a little silk thread hanging out of it. That silk thread is not an accident. In some of these marriage manuals that were passed around at the time, people would have the need to discover if they were pregnant, and one recommendation was to urinate on a silk thread, burn it, and then look at the color. And this would let you know if you were pregnant or not. I do not recommend this method. It's obviously an old wives' tale at the time, but that's what they thought. And so that seems to be what's going on here. And then just really to hammer it all home, there's a love letter on the floor that's been discarded. So what is the message of this scene? What is Jan Steen trying to get across? What he's trying to get across is that the mother over here has done screwed up. She has been blithely playing her virginal, providing music that has been enticing to this young woman and her male friend, and they have not led a virtuous life. So again, it's this kind of farce that lets you know that life is complicated, and so don't be like this. In this case, I think the main message is don't be like the mother. Don't be the mother who's, having, young men over for house parties and not paying attention to what your daughter is doing. Make sure you know what's going on and watch what your daughters are doing, and don't create an environment where that would happen. People have always been concerned about teenage pregnancy, not just today. And this gets to another one that's fabulous. This one is Beware of Luxury. This, of course, is just a fabulous scene. Now, this scene is, again, just completely over the top, but it gives you a sense of the kind of message that's happening. So here we have the woman of the house. You can see her in her very sensible house frock, with her feet up on a foot warmer again, but notice she is asleep. And the message here is pretty simple. This is what happens when you are not paying attention. All the things that can go wrong in the household. First of all, you have itinerant musicians come in. The kids will actually get into the tobacco cabinet and start smoking. Dogs will get on the table and start eating food. The baby is into the jewels. The wine or the ale is spilling out on the floor. There's mess everywhere. This woman, by her dress, is a housemaid and not a housewife, but she holds a jug of wine, and she seems to be getting a little frisky with the man of the house. He is there, and she is offering a glass of wine. So, watch your husbands, or your husbands will start taking up with the staff. The whole scene is one of chaos, even to the point that you have monkeys messing up with the clocks and sows and pigs coming in from the outside. One of my favorite details, though, are these two characters right here. And you may not recognize who these characters are. This is a woman who is dressed like a nun. She has a habit, but she's also carrying roses. So she is probably a Rosicrucian. This one, people usually guess. This guy, he's wearing a pilgrim hat, what we would consider to be a pilgrim hat in America, and he's reading from the scriptures. But what's the duck on his shoulders? Well, what do ducks do? Ducks quack. So this is a quacker. This is a Quaker. So what's happening here is it's saying so if you fall asleep and don't pay attention, all kinds of crazy things will happen in your house. And one of the worst is that these religious radicals, Rosicrucians and Quakers, will come into your house. I suppose if you were painting this today, it would be Mormon missionaries and Jehovah's Witnesses. I can say that because I am Mormon. So, watch yourself. You don't want any of those religious crazies entering your house. It's very, very fun. So it's this pandemonium. One of the other great genre painters of the time is actually Judith Leyster. Judith Leyster, again, another one of these rare female artists that actually excelled in her own time period, to the point that other artists were actually copying her. I think she actually sued Frans Hals for copying one of her paintings successfully. So that shows it. She was actually highly prized and highly praised, and in her own time, another painter made a pun on her name. Her name is very similar to lodestar, a lodestar being something that you guide a ship by. So they said that she is like, her name. She is like the lodestar, the way to find it. And she was an incredible painter. She specialized in genre scenes like this. So here she is painting herself, painting one of these genre scenes. She specialized in troubadours and people making music. So we have a scene of a person with a violin. Here's another scene. This is the young flute player here. Notice we have a violin and a flute on the wall. Notice her direct style. She is like these other painters, moving in a direction towards a flatter, more direct surface-based paint where we can see the texture and see the brushwork. So much like other painters of the time, she was moving in that direction as well. Some of these paintings are very easy to get the meaning of. This one is The Last Drop, and of course this is the guy draining the last drop out of his wine jug. And everyone's having a fun time, smoking, drinking, and even Death has joined into the party. Well, the message here is pretty clear. Death holds up the hourglass saying, yeah, get that last drop in because I'm coming. So the message here is kind of has a fun duality, that it's part of it is like eat, drink and be merry before tomorrow we die. But it's also, hey, you are accelerating your way towards death. So while this shows a scene of excess, it also gives a message of, hey, of moderation and restraint. It becomes a fun morality tale. What I love the most about Judith Leyster, though, is that, again, being a female artist, she's going to have a different understanding and a female perspective. Most of the women that we've seen so far have been in the position of being a temptress. That is, somebody who is soliciting males for sex, or as someone who is a dangerous figure, at least in terms of sexual persona. So let's take a look. If we go back to Ter Borch's figure, the women here are clearly seen as temptresses, or at the very least as fallen women. The same thing is here. You can see this likewise in the works of Jan Steen. Jan Steen shows this girl as very clearly as somebody who has made a bad life choice. And so women are seen as temptresses or as figures of derision. And that's pretty typical. I hate to break it to you, but the 17th century, is a pretty sexist time age. We still have some of these horrible stereotypes ourselves. But when you see women in the works of Judith Leyster, you see something different. And so this is fundamentally like the counterpoint. This is kind of the counterpoint to the painting by Ter Borch. So here we have a woman who is being offered money for sex and is clearly interested in the deal, is interested in this opportunity of transactional sex. But here we have a woman that's very different. Here the man very clearly grabs onto her shoulder, has a handful of coins, and is very clearly propositioning her, hey, let's get this on for money. And she is having none of it. She instead doesn't look at him. She's incredibly modestly dressed, and she is looking to her needlepoint. And she is, even though there's a foot warmer down here to indicate that, yes, women have sexual desires, like all people, she is being a virtuous figure. And so we see this in the works of Judith Leyster. Instead of women being seen as seductresses and temptresses, they are seen as paragons of virtue. So you can't ever underestimate the role of a female perspective. And I don't think we would see this if in the works of a male artist. Every once in a while, but not nearly so much. So that finally gets us to Jan Vermeer. Jan Vermeer, for us, is probably one of the most famous of all the Dutch genre painters. But he actually was an obscure genre painter at the time. In fact, many of these painters painted hundreds of paintings. I think there's only 32 confirmed Jan Vermeer paintings, and a handful of others that may or may not be. The whole thing is complicated because there was a terrible forgery scandal in the early 20th century where you had this terrible fraud creating fake Vermeers. And he claimed that many of the Vermeers were that are in the museums were actually his paintings, but everybody thinks that he's just an arsonist. He's a cultural arsonist, that he probably didn't paint those. He's just claiming to cause doubt. But he was a relatively unknown painter, not terribly famous in his own time, and fell into obscurity for a couple of centuries. It isn't until the 19th century that people start looking at his paintings and realizing how exceptional they are. I think it's very appropriate that when we look at him, this may be his only portrait, and we never see his face. We're seeing him from the back. And he's now recognized as one of the supreme painters of Dutch genre art. This is the art of painting. This is one we talked about before, but again, it demonstrates so much about why Vermeer is significant today. First off, notice we have, again, the map in the background. But we have him attending to his painting. It's a smaller painting. One of the things that really identifies a Vermeer painting is the light source. His light is also always a kind of full and open light. He doesn't use heavy tenebrism or shadows like earlier Dutch painters. Instead, he's going to be using a kind of brighter, more uniform light. The light almost always comes from the left and illuminates figures. They're going to be small, intimate scenes. One of the things that also identifies Vermeer is his minimalistic approach. In some ways, his paintings are very rich, but when you look at them, there's just a few colors you can see in this drapery and in her sleeve. There's not much blending. Instead, the color is just allowed to just lay on the surface. This makes it look flatter in a way, but as you pull back, it has an almost photographic quality. This has led many people to suggest that he was using a camera obscura, and of course, this gets us back to the Hockney-Falco hypothesis, which I talked about earlier in the discussion on Netherlandish art in the Quattrocento. There's also a very famous documentary that's come out that was sponsored by Gillette Penn, of Penn and Teller fame, one of his friends who has concocted this entire theory that he used a mirror device, and so that this is another one of these arguments for them using optical devices. There's some evidence that he did have a camera obscura, and this influenced his understanding of light, but again, it ends up being a conspiracy theory. You just have to believe that everyone else was silent about this and no one else ever stumbled upon it, which seems pretty remote. But they do have this kind of photographic quality, so who knows? It's always hard. It's impossible to say. I think it's kind of hard to say. He was known for two things. One, he would paint these landscapes. So we would see beautiful landscapes and cityscapes. He was active and he lived in Delft. And so most of these are going to be scenes, and they're just touching. Again, one of the qualities of Vermeer is that he captures this sense of the moment, almost as if it is a snapshot, ordinary people doing ordinary things. Here's another one where you really do get a sense of what I'm talking about, of how simple and yet how powerful his painting can be. Look at this water jug. You can see that the water jug is constructed over just a handful of brushstrokes. It has like a solid blue stripe and a solid orange stripe to show the reflection. The highlights are just little blobs, and yet that conveys that so well. Again, another one of these cases of doing more with less. You can see that the drapery is almost broken down like into planes, almost like a planar polygonal shape. But again, you'll see this always. Woman, window on the left. It's very common. That's very stereotypical. But much like other paintings and Dutch paintings, there is this moralizing quality to the paintings. There are stories to be told, and you have to look at the background to understand what's happening. So here we have a woman. She's in her housecoat. The Netherlands, again, is a kind of a cold country, so housecoats and foot warmers make sense. And in this case, she's weighing pearls. Beautiful pearls. And again, the pearls here are painted in a very minimalist way. They're just a single circle with a little bit of a highlight, and yet that really makes the pearls sing. Same thing with the details and the highlights on her hand and face. But it's in the background that gives us the sense of what's really happening here. Here we have a painting, and if you look at the painting, it has Christ, and this is a judgment scene. This is the Last Judgment. So there's a connection between what she's doing. She's judging pearls. She's weighing pearls. She's weighing them in a little scale and balance. So she's making a personal judgment about personal wealth. But the painting in the background, again, nothing is accident. Nothing just happens to be there. It's not like photography where you can catch something in the background unintentionally. The artist put it in there to say, she is concerning herself with worldly judgments, but she ought to be considered about the judgment of her soul. Which is a little bit more tender. It's a little softer approach. It's not as full of sexual innuendo as a Terborch, and it's not as over the top and farcical as a Steen, but it's still that moralizing tale. You can see that in a lot of his works. A lot of his works deal with, again, women. This one we have a guy in a fabulous cape. Gosh, why can't capes come back? Again, seen stonewashed jeans come back 3 times. Bell bottoms have come back 3 times. Even grunge seems to be coming back now. Gosh, why can't we bring back capes and fabulous hats? But anyhow, and he's got a wine jug and she's drinking wine. Notice that there is a musical instrument on the chair. Again, all of this is indicating she has to watch herself here. She has to be careful that perhaps the intent of this figure is not chivalrous or virtuous. I love this one for the same reason. We have one guy who's kind of dowsing off at the table, and the figure here, is being handed a glass of wine. I mean, this guy has just a fantastic expression on his face, and I love how she looks back at the audience, breaking the fourth wall. She's having a fun time, but we can't carry it too far, because there on the wall we have a very paternal figure, probably representing the family and the patriarch of the family, who is looking on disapproving. So this is the whole message is, watch what you do while your parents are away. Bad things can happen, especially if your chaperone is nodding off at the table. But then you have these wonderful little details, like oranges peeled and on a platter, and have these beautiful just highlights that so little is painting there, but magnificent. Here's another one, again, similar theme. In this case, we have music on the table. Again, music, lutes, are giving us allusions to sex and love. And this person is delivering a letter, and he's a messenger. And of course, the question is, what is the letter about? Well, if you can look very faintly in the background, you have a painting, and the painting has an image of a figure that my daughters refer to as the mascot of Single Awareness Day, or Valentine's Day. This is Cupid. And so the figure of Cupid, which is so faint, but it's definitely there, is indicating this is a love letter. And she looks out to us wistfully, forlornly. And there's one other clue here that lets her know this is a bird cage. Okay, birds were very popular pets. Finches were very popular pets at this time. And so the whole message becomes clear. She feels like she's living in a cage. And what she wishes for is freedom, and the love letter gives her this chance at freedom, but there's a warning there. You can see this Cupid figure in the background a little better. This is, again, a woman standing at a virginal. A virginal was a kind of forerunner to the harpsichord and pianoforte. And again, she looks directly at us. I think that's what really captivates people about Vermeer, is that his women have this power to captivate us. There's something voyeuristic here, but at the same time, they address us. We feel like we're involved, as if, she clearly also is thinking about love, because not only is she playing at a virginal, but she has in the background this emblem. And again, these emblems were borrowed from emblem books. You have all kinds of emblems representing various features of love. And so she is thinking about love and looking out at us. Likewise, take a look at her sleeve. That sleeve is rendered almost in two colors. So again, very simplistic way of rendering a sleeve, but it's very powerful. So that both for his painting style and for his kind of tenderness, and how could we leave without looking at a woman with a pearl earring, that gives us this same sense. She looks directly at us. She addresses us with her eyes. She becomes in a dialogue with us. But at the same time, when we look at that pearl, when we look at her headscarf, there is very little paint there. I mean, look at it. You can count the brushstrokes in her sash. It's a very powerful and simple way to paint, but it's very evocative. And then when he adds it with these compositional strengths, and particularly these views of having these women in dialogue with us, the viewer, they become very, very powerful. So you can understand why Vermeer started as a very obscure painter, but was rediscovered in the 19th century and has now become elevated to one of the highest and most favored of painters. Well, that will wrap up the Dutch Golden Age for us. Gosh, we could do so much more, but we do have to move on. And we will move on to the French Baroque and Rococo in the next lecture. Thanks so much. See you next time. Bye-bye.